Trick or Treat, Stalked on Halloween. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. Halloween was always very special to me. Along with Christmas, Halloween was a day in which anything seemed possible. It was a day when the extraordinary became ordinary. Even the dull monotony of going to school was transformed into something fun and exciting. Classrooms and hallways were eerily decorated with paper decorations of witches, black cats, pumpkins, skeletons, and ghosts. You, along with all of your friends and classmates, were dressed up in costumes that you wouldn't have been permitted to wear on any other day. Amazingly, in the spirit of Halloween, many of the teachers dressed up in costumes too. Candy was shared in classrooms, and a spooky school Halloween parade was held. It was truly magical. As fantastical as Halloween always was, one particular Halloween was the most fantastical of all. The year was 1991. I was 12 years old and in the 7th grade at the time. October 31st fell on a Thursday that fateful year. A cold rain in the morning had departed and left behind a ghostly fog which had enveloped the entire Hudson Valley. The spectral mist surrounded the fantastic fall foliage. The leaves, with their various shades of orange and red, seemed to have shined through the fog as though they radiated a soft light. Simply put, the landscape looked as though a spooky cartoon depiction of Halloween had sprung to life. My parents had said that I could take my little sister, Haley, out trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. Pedro, my best friend, came along with us. It was the first time that we had gone trick-or-treating without our parents. The taste of independence, or so we thought, would surely make the candy more delicious. I chose to be a vampire for Halloween. My dad, who was dressed as an undead ghoul, had put on my makeup for me. Dad and I loved horror movies, and we particularly loved vampire movies. Fright Night, The Lost Boys, and Salem's Lot were our favorite vampire flicks. He did a terrific job of making me look like the vampire from Nosferatu. With Dad's help, I looked delightfully dreadful. Haley had chosen to be a witch for Halloween. Mom had gotten her a costume from the store, and she applied her green makeup for her. Haley wore the classical black conical witch's hat along with a black dress. She carried a plastic orange pumpkin to put all of her treats in. She was so excited that day. She almost loved Halloween as much as I did. The elementary school's Halloween parade earlier that day had really lit the fire of Haley's anticipation. She had won Best Halloween Short Story in her 4th grade class. The Grim Reaper is what Pedro had chosen to be for that Halloween. He was dressed in a homemade black robe with a hood. Pedro's mother had lovingly sewed his costume for him. The details of his robe were far superior to anything available in the store. The macabre robe even had a skull and crossbones on the chest. The backside was adorned with a half moon and the words, "Fear the Reaper." Sunset was at 5:53 p.m. Pedro, Haley, and I left my house to go trick-or-treating at 5:30. We wanted to be out walking the neighborhood as the sun set. Dusk was the perfect time to begin our Halloween adventure. There's something magical about being outside as day transforms to night. That sense of something magical is only increased on Halloween. On Halloween, we got the chance to be the monsters. If we were the monsters, then we had nothing to fear. Or at least, in our innocence, that's what we had thought. The eerie fog covered the streets of Junction Ridge. As the sun went down, the fog began to take an unsettling and unnatural appearance. Our neighborhood in Junction Ridge had always gotten into the Halloween spirit. Most of the houses put up Halloween decorations in their front yards. The orange Halloween lights from these home haunts had given the fog an unearthly glow. The fog, the orange lights, and the life-sized monster props created an ominous atmosphere. Each person's yard was like a scary scene from another world. Similarly, each door that opened after you knocked on it was a glimpse into the home and lives of the people who lived there. How amazing it was to wonder what their lives were like. The imagination ran wild as you considered what similarities and differences might exist between their families and yours. Today's trunk-or-treating can't compete with good old-fashioned trick-or-treating. The truly bizarre events of that night began shortly after sunset. It started as the three of us had heard a distant voice calling out, "Hey, hey, Haley." This ghostly call haunted us for the remainder of our time trick-or-treating. The voice calling out my sister's name seemed to come about every 20 minutes or so. It wasn't a voice that we recognized, and it seemed otherworldly in some way. It was like hearing a broken up or a faded voice on a long-distance call. If that wasn't creepy enough, we heard a wolf howling in the distance. It made us very unnerved. We became more unnerved as we became aware that a man was following us. The man was tall and thin, seemingly unnaturally thin. He wore a red robe with a red hood. His creepy outfit was accentuated by his realistic skeleton mask. To make light of the potential threat that we perceived he might pose, we nicknamed him Old Thinny. He was accompanied by what appeared to be a wolf. I knew that it couldn't have been a wolf, so I assumed that it must have been a husky. At around 6:30 p.m. we had lost sight of him. As I stood still, I turned my head around like it was on a swivel to see if I could locate Old Thinny. I was pushed to the ground by Gary Bormat. Gary was the school bully. He mercilessly bullied Pedro and I. He also hadn't been the sharpest tack in the box. He was only in 7th grade with us because he failed 7th grade the previous year. "What's your problem? Why don't you leave us alone?" asked Pedro as he extended his hand to help me up from the ground. "You want to know what my problem is? I'll tell you. My problem is that you and your friend Johnny are dorks. I hate dorks and I hate you," replied Gary coldly. "Hey Gary, just leave us alone," I said. "Aw, baby Johnny wants us to leave him alone," Gary said in a whiny voice as his two overgrown cohorts emerged from the fog. Gary's friend Jack handed him a baseball bat. With a sick smile on his face, Gary took the steel baseball bat, ran towards a nearby jack-o'-lantern on someone's yard display, and he struck it with the bat. The jack-o'-lantern was shattered. Gary's other barbarian of a friend, Simon, laughed like a madman. The bullies weren't dressed up for Halloween. They wore their ordinary, everyday clothes. "Leave us alone, you jerks! If you don't leave us alone, my big brother is going to make you regret it," Haley threatened. "Your brother Johnny is a loser. All three of you are pathetic losers. Johnny is even more of a little girl than you are, you ugly little brat," said Gary as he stepped closer. "Yeah, Johnny and Pedro are real girly men. Only girly men dress up for Halloween," sneered Jack and Simon. Fearless, Haley slapped Gary across his acne-covered face. Gary's brutish face became blood red as he pushed Haley to the ground. He was about to get on top of her, but I tackled him to the ground and punched him right in his face. Blood began to flow from his nose. White-hot adrenaline had flooded my body, and I had acted on pure instinct and rage. Before I could hit Gary a second time, 4 hands pulled me off of him. Gary's cohorts, Jack and Simon, had stepped in to save Gary from being humiliated further. As Jack restrained me, Simon punched me in the gut. Pedro came to my aid and punched Simon's jaw. Gary had retrieved the bat and blindsided Pedro by swinging away at his back. Pedro went crashing down to the ground face first. Swinging the bat wildly through the air, Gary walked toward me. He had become unhinged as he threatened. "You're dead! You're all dead! I'm going to kill you all!" Suddenly, Jack screamed in terror. Each of us turned to see that he was being dragged backward into the fog. A red-robed figure was effortlessly dragging Jack away. The fog obscured what happened next. Jack's screams grew more distant, and then they ceased. Each of us stopped dead in our tracks. The silence was deafening. Before we could process what was happening, the silhouette of a tall and extremely thin figure in a hooded red robe slowly approached us. As the figure came closer, I saw that it wore a lifelike skeleton mask. It was Old Thinny. Gary, with baseball bat in hand, began to walk towards Old Thinny. Simon, always the mindless follower, followed. Frozen by wonder and fear, Pedro, Haley, and I looked on. As Old Thinny drew closer, it became clear that his feet weren't touching the ground. His feet were about 6 inches above the ground. He was floating. In fact, he was floating directly towards our attackers. Gary stopped. He must have seen that this mysterious red-hooded figure was floating toward him. Old Thinny continued to slowly and menacingly float toward the remaining bullies. Gary yelled, "I don't know what you are, but you're gonna pay for this!" Old Thinny responded, "You're right about one thing. You don't know what I am. Your puny mind can't even imagine who and what I am. But you're wrong about the other thing. It's you who's going to pay." "Whatever, bonehead. We're not afraid of you," replied Gary as if he was trying to convince himself. "You should be. Indeed, you should be very afraid of me," said Old Thinny as he raised his right arm and pointed at Gary. In doing so, it was revealed that the hooded figure wasn't wearing a costume. He was truly a skeleton. Simon's face grew paler than a ghost. He turned and ran away. Right before our very eyes, Old Thinny had morphed into a horrific, demonic-looking clown. He took out a chain and lassoed Simon. The grotesque clown reeled Simon in like a fish. The sound of the rattling chain whipping through the air added to the already sky-high levels of fear. After the ferocious clown pulled Simon in, it grasped him with its claw-like hands. Then it pulled its head back and opened its mouth until it was 2 feet wide. A light began to leave from Simon's mouth, and it entered into the grotesque clown's mouth. This must have continued over several minutes. When the transfer of light or energy was complete, Simon's lifeless body dropped to the floor like a sack of potatoes. His skin had turned white as snow, and his body had shriveled. Haley cried. Mouths agape, Pedro and I watched the gruesome scene as though we had been frozen in time. It had been the sound of Haley's crying that snapped me out of the trance-like state. I shook Pedro, grappled Haley's delicate little hand, and yelled, "Run!" The 3 of us ran like the wind. As we were running, we noticed that Old Thinny was never out of sight. He wasn't moving, and yet, no matter how fast or how far we ran, we didn't create any distance between us and that monster. It was as though the fog truly was otherworldly. The orange-tinted, glowing fog had acted as a magical barrier. After 5 minutes of sprinting around, we fell to our knees. I saw Gary repeatedly strike the clown-like creature with his bat, but it had no effect. After his arms grew tired, he dropped the baseball bat. Exhausted, he said, "Who are you, and what do you want with me?" The hideous clown stared at Gary and answered, "I have numerous names. I am Fear. I am Dread. I am the bringer of death. I am the swallower of souls. I am Halloween. As to what I want with you, it's the same as I wanted from your moronic cohorts. Respect and fear is what I desire. Each Halloween I move over the earth searching for disrespectful fools such as yourself. You and your disrespectful friends do not have the Halloween spirit. You did not honor this most magnificent and special day. Not only did you not wear a costume or decorate your homes, but you had the audacity to mock those who did honor the Halloween spirit. The penalty for your crimes is death. Not only will I kill you, but I'll swallow your soul too. Your soul will belong to me, and I'll take you to my world where you'll eternally be my slave. Oh, and one more thing. I have a special surprise for you. I know how much you like werewolves." As the ghoulish figure completed those words, he transformed into a great, big, and ferocious werewolf. The clothes that the clown had been wearing tore apart, and hair grew out of its skin. The body remained similar to the shape of a man, but its head got longer and became wolf-like. The snout was long. Its eyes were glowing yellow, and its teeth were large and sharp. It was as if the teeth of a T-Rex had replaced the smaller teeth of the clown-like figure. Gary peed in his pants as his body shook all over. The werewolf lunged at Gary, grabbed him by his throat with his right hand, and lifted him several feet off of the ground. The werewolf unhinged its jaws, and the light of Gary's soul began draining into the creature's mouth. The creature sucked in the light until the light was gone. After it had finished feeding, it dropped Gary's corpse to the ground like it was garbage. The disturbing creature then returned to the frightful shape of a skeleton wearing a red hooded robe. It once again looked like Old Thinny. He levitated about half of a foot off of the ground and began floating toward us. As he hovered closer, closer, ever closer, he hummed a song that you might expect the organ to be playing in Dracula's castle. We tried to run, but it was of no use. The mystical fog had mysteriously imprisoned us. My blood had already run cold. Each moment felt like an eternity had passed. I felt powerless to protect my sister or my friend. Fear consumed my being. Just when I thought that it was impossible to be more afraid, the fear increased even more. This fiendish ghoul, Old Thinny, came within a yard of us. He looked right at me and said, "Boy, do I have a Halloween treat for you." Old Thinny then morphed into a vampire. He looked like the classical version of the vampire in Nosferatu. Grayish flesh grew over his bones. He had 2 red, glowing eyes. His fingers and fingernails were long. 2 sharp, pointy fangs protruded from his mouth over his lips. It was absolutely terrifying. The ghastly thing then looked at me with its glowing red eyes and said, "This one's for you, kid. I know that vampires are your favorite. Everyone is entitled to a scare on Halloween. I'm quite sure that you'll never forget this splendid night, nor will you ever watch a vampire film the same way again. This is my dark gift to you. Simon's greatest fear was a clown, so I assumed the form that would frighten him the most. For Gary, I became a werewolf, because that was his worst nightmare. As a bonus, their souls taste so delicious when they're terrified. Old Thinny then bent down and took Haley's hand. My skin crawled as my stomach churned with crippling anxiety. Old Thinny lifted my sister's soft hand to his lips and he kissed it. After he gently kissed her hand, he said, "Sweet little girl, you have a gift. Your short horror stories are splendidly horrific. We will be watching your writing career with great anticipation." Standing up straight, Old Thinny looked at all three of us as he said, "The three of you are blessed with a strong Halloween spirit. Very few people respect, enjoy, and honor this most wonderful day as you do. The spirit of spookiness is strong with you. Don't ever change." The three of us felt the greatest relief that we had ever felt when we realized that he wasn't going to harm us. Old Thinny then returned to his red hooded skeleton form and floated into the fog. He called for his furry companion. A wolf howled and then came running to his side. The wolf had glowing orange eyes. With his wolf at his side, Old Thinny floated away. Just before he disappeared into the ethereal orange-tinted fog, he turned back and said, "Happy Halloween." So it was that we would never forget that Halloween on Thursday in 1991. We were stalked while trick-or-treating, and I believe that the ghoulish stalker saved our lives. If you ever think that you are too old for Halloween, remember Old Thinny. If you disrespect or desecrate Halloween, the ghostly spirit of Halloween might just pay you a terrifying visit. The Halloween that you decide to mock or attack those who love the holiday might well be your last. Always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there. I hope that you enjoyed your stay here at the Haunted Half Moon Inn. The Master requests that you consider supporting me and the inn by becoming a patron of mine on Patreon. The Half Moon Inn needs your support to keep the doors open. You wouldn't want the residents here to feel forgotten and abandoned, would you? Creating quality scary stories to share with you is very important to me. Running this inn of horror is a passion of mine, and I would truly appreciate your support. The world is hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, with your help, we could haunt this world one home at a time. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.